maybe we can start by the first question I had when reading at your text. And it is about the relationship between Josefina Pierini, who was Lisa's wife, and Lisa, and maybe the importance of that relationship, not only on the romantic side, but on the intellectual side. When you were writing your conference, you pointed that element out, and I thought that it would be wonderful to start the conversation by discussing that specific topic.
I love that you chose this as your first question, because I do think that Josefina, who was his wife, had a major impact on his work. Many other scholars think that she may have as well, and that she may have actually influenced the direction that he took in his kind of philosophical aesthetic views. So let me tell you a little bit about her. And, you know, I think she's kind of an unsung presence in his life, but she was a fascinating woman. She was a school teacher, and she actually married him when she was 39 years old. He was 43, so he was 4 years older. And if I do my math correctly, which may or may not be the case, if he was 4 years older, that means that she received a doctorate in 1928, and she would have been born then in 1899, which would have made her about 29 years old. So think about the impact of a woman, just a woman in her own right, getting a PhD at that time, you know, in the late 20s, and she's only 29 years old. So it's pretty interesting. And then it gets more interesting because she actually gets a doctorate in philosophy, which is, as we know, and we will discuss, Esteban Lisa kind of goes in that direction towards philosophical aesthetics. And so, you know, it's very hard to imagine that her presence, her ideas, and her dedication to her own science would not have influenced Lisa. So on the picture on the left here, you see them. This is just a fabulous picture. Probably sometime, you know, during their long courtship, they were courting for quite a long time. I don't know exactly how long, but you consider that she was already 39 when they got married and he was 43. It probably stands to reason that it was a long courtship. And that's not unusual in a Latin American culture to have a long courtship, and certainly not at that time. But I think it does say something about their dedication to their ideas, to their profession. They both were school teachers. They worked together for over 20 years, teaching classes in these kind of centro culturales, these kind of state institutions that were set up and to teach art. And so he had never, Lisa himself had never actually gotten an undergraduate degree or gotten a PhD. And so it's interesting to kind of think of their evolution over these 20 years and how much she probably contributed to that kind of development. And she was very much behind the idea of him starting these escuelas adultos, or these adult schools in you know, these middle class working immigrant barrios, these neighborhoods. And so all of those influences, I think, are going to be really important as we delve into who Lisa was and what his ideas were and how he was painting to kind of reflect those ideas.
Yes, thank you so much. And
Yeah.
but I would like to ask a little bit about, do you think as well that her presence in his life actually also helped him to like develop his work as a teacher? Do you think maybe that was also part of the element?
Absolutely. You know, I mean, I think you have to kind of think about Esteban Lisa. He was from Spain, as we know from many of your other interviews, but he was from Spain, from Toledo, actually, which is historically a center of great learning and great kind of migration and syncretism in terms of monotheistic Abrahamic religions. You know, you had the Jewish, the Islamic, and the Christian uh, religions coexisting in that space for many years, whether it was uh, under Muslim rule or whether it was under Christian rule. So it was considered an erudite place for all of medieval times. And so, you know, he comes from this kind of aspect of learning and this culture. And he arrives as an immigrant at 15, and he didn't have the opportunity to go to school. He didn't have the opportunity to continue learning. And he took what he could do, which was he went to a school, and he was very talented in art, and that was recognized. And so he was schooled in that direction. And I think the fascinating thing is that you know, you have an intellectually curious person who maybe wasn't given the opportunities to further his education, and he didn't have that, but he was scrappy, and he took what he could get and really emerged from those opportunities kind of like a butterfly, you know, coming from the cocoon. He just kept learning his whole life. And it would be amazing to me if Josefina did not influence him in the ways that didactically and also philosophically. So I think she's pretty much an unsung hero. And, you know, they didn't have children, but they were devoted to teaching. They were devoted to making education available to those who didn't have maybe the opportunities that some of the more well-known kind of Buenos Aires movements, artistic aesthetic movements may have provided to others who did have more means. So I think she's just an incredible woman. And I think she really, really influenced and kind of channeled maybe his intellectual aesthetic movements.
Thank you so much. Yeah, when I was reading your text, I felt that as a very important point to like highlight and to discuss, not only to understand Lisa's practice, but also Lisa's interest in like writing, which leads me to the second question actually that I have for you. And it is that relation between text and image, which is one of your main focus of interest when looking at any different artists. And for that reason, I would like to ask you, like, what do you think it is the connection or the relationship between Lisa's artistic practice and Lisa's writing practice, and how you would characterize the connections or the points of contact between the philosophical thinking and the creative practice of the artist?
Well, you know, if we talk about his writings, then we're going to go down a deep, dark hole.
Yeah.
So, rabbit hole, because he was a prolific writer. And, you know, I'm not sure if the listeners are aware of the fact that while he published many, many books, he never showed his works of art. He never publicly had an exhibition and never kind of proclaimed himself to be this great artist. So what he used his art for really was to develop these kind of philosophical underpinnings and these aesthetic ideas that he had. So there's definitely a correlation between his writing and his art. And, you know, I think the other thing that's really interesting is that you can see shifts in his artwork. So, you know, shifts in his own style as he progresses, you know, throughout his artistic career. And I say artistic career from an art scholar's point of view, but certainly he did not think of himself as having an artistic career. But in the early 30s, in 1934, there was a show on Picasso. There was an exhibit of Joaquin Torres Garcia's work, who was this Uruguayan who had gone to Europe and spent several decades, most of his, adult life in Europe, and then decided to come back to Latin America and influence this abstract movement. So that happened in 1934. And in 1935, we see this really large shift as Esteban Lisa moves away from figuration and embraces abstraction. And, as we look at his work developing throughout the decades, we see this kind of a more kind of lighthearted, if you will, and joyful and kind of exploration on a very limited kind of plane of like 8 by 11, 8
Yes.
inches by 11 inches, just like a paper size, but an infinite exploration of lines and dots and forms. And so these kind of philosophical underpinnings that he's writing about is actually being represented and manifested in these drawings and in these paintings. So, he does this kind of infinite exploration of what is art, what is abstraction to him. And it kind of reflects what it doesn't kind of reflects, but it absolutely does reflect what he's writing about, in his kind of philosophical essays and his writings and his books. So he's publishing all of these books. So one of the important books that he publishes in 1956 is this book on Einstein, Kant, and Picasso. So right now, just looking at the personalities that he's pointing to on the cover page, we know that Lisa is thinking big. He's not held back by the fact that he's an autodidact, that he's self-taught, that he has, taken the years to do this. And just consider he's now 60 years old. I mean, by the time he's writing this, by the time he's getting into his second, kind of, well, some people would say third age, but second wind in the writing, he's already 60 years old. So he thinks big. He does not think small. So he paints small, but what he's doing in those small painting is really big ideas about philosophy. It's like the exploration of all of the dimensions. So the name of this, of course, is, you have it up there, thank you, Kant, Einstein, and Picasso. And he talks about the fourth dimension, which is actually time. So if we break it down, and I'm not a scientist by any means, so I had to do, when I wrote my essay, I actually had to do some research. But I can kind of understand this from an artistic point of view, from the point of view that he approached it from, which is to say that the second dimension is flat, what all the abstract expressionists were trying to achieve. The third dimension was space. So you can if you can imagine like spheres, painting spheres against this second dimension, that would be space. And then the fourth dimension is time. And so he was really interested in the space-time kind of continuum that Einstein was promoting. And what I found to be very interesting is, in his work, it was very hard to find examples of third dimension, although he did paint spheres and cylinders, which do kind of exemplify this idea of space, right? And then the fourth dimension, time, is very hard to capture in paintings. But, arguably, as you look at some of his actos espaciales, some of those, and I don't know if you have any of those to put up, but you can yeah, that's perfect. that you can kind of see, like if you start with one line on the right side and then you kind of trace it all the way through to the left side, that's kind of an example of time. So what he's trying to do is he is trying to exemplify, or maybe even work out in his art, what these kind of philosophical underpinnings mean for him. And so I find this to be really fascinating. If you look at this Acto Especial, it's 1954, and he writes his book in 1956. So I think he actually used his work to kind of, as an exercise, to kind of help him understand the intellectual, philosophical aspects of what is going on in his mind. He had no intention to exhibit these. I think what he was trying to do is use art to reach his conclusions in terms of aesthetics and science.
So like artistic practice is a way of thinking, you would say.
Artistic practice is a way of thinking. And what I thought was really interesting, Juan Gabriel, as a teacher, I do my homework. I looked at these wonderful interviews that you did with Ariel Zyberberg, who is the son of Isaac Zyberberg, who was the student of Lisa. And, I think he was reflecting, and I think he was on to something when he made this kind of passing comment that, Lisa was not really interested in art for art's sake. It was really to capture, what it was, what his thoughts were. And I thought that, Ariel was really on to something, because it helps to explain why he never showed his work. And
Yes.
Right.
And I mean, I think from that side, the idea of thinking of art making as a practice in which the artist is not considering the final result, but actually the process in itself, it's quite interesting. Like it actually points out to that specific idea that you're pointing out of, or that you're like showing us about, like art as a way of thinking, but also, and something that Jorge Virgili said in the conversation that we had was that also time would be present with the idea of the series when you put together many of the artworks that he would make at a specific period of time, like for instance, Actos Espaciales of 1953, 1954, you would have that same idea of repetition that you're kind of highlighting here. And like those are ways to approach the question that make one think that the practice was more important than the artwork, and like that it was as equal as the artwork in itself.
And I totally agree. And I think Jorge Virgili also made another important point in terms of the fact that Lisa, having been born in Toledo and being Spanish, I think he self-identified more with European artists than he did with the abstract movements that were so strong coming out of Argentina. So, you had the Mahdi movement, and you have the concretos, and, I think this kind of particular combination of the European background, which I agree with Jorge Virgili that, I think he was more oriented towards like Paul Klee or Mondrian or some of those European artists. But fascinatingly enough, I think his presence in Buenos Aires and his presence as a school teacher in these barrios, in these neighborhoods with immigrant workers and middle-class learners and adults who were interested in continuing to learn. I think all of that kind of contributed to this kind of mixing that was happening in Buenos Aires. You had a lot of Spanish and Italian immigrants. You had Jewish immigrants from Northern Europe and Central Europe. And you even had a small Arab population. So, again, you echo that kind of foundation that he was exposed to in Toledo through history, through architecture, through synagogues, through churches. So I think it was that particular combination of being European and also being scrappy and immigrant, and for Buenos Aires allowing that immigrant lens and that immigrant perspective, and you come up with this kind of really unique, unusual person. And, I mean, you can see from this book that he was thinking big thoughts, and he actually was quite bold, not in his artwork, because he never showed it, he never, exhibited it, but he sent his writings to Nassau. He sent his writings to the Biblioteca Nacional of Spain in Madrid. So here's a guy who really had great confidence in his theories. And, we circle back to Josefina.
Yeah.
And I think that, she had a lot to do with that. And I think his confidence stemmed from thinking, she legitimizes and lends credibility to my writings and to my thinking. So I must be good. I must be, and I don't think he had a problem with self-esteem in terms of his writings. And I think a lot of that may come from Josefina, who had a doctorate.
I actually like that specific point leads me to the next question that last time that we spoke, I thought was the most interesting part of our conversation. And it is that process of identification of him as an artist, as a writer. And so you already pointed out the fact that he didn't show his work, like his artistic work, to people, but on the opposite side, he would always send copies of his books to different libraries, like worldwide. And so that leads me to that very interesting question of someone who is a like a art teacher for immigrants in schools all his life, that has this project of creating a school that it is called La Escuela de las Cuatro Dimensiones, and then like spends a lot of time working on his own writing practice and actually showing it. I wanted to ask you, what are your thoughts considering the fact that he decided to just hide his work, his artistic work, and like how that would affect his identity when he was living, when he was producing? And up to which point do you think that these decisions actually kind of play in his favor as an artist or not? Like,
Great questions. I think what makes Lisa so fascinating for me is this enigma that you're pointing to. Here's an autodidact who has taught himself. He's a teacher, but he's a school teacher for immigrant adults. And I think he had very big ideas. I think that those ideas were transferred through the art to his writing. I mean, certainly this series of, you showed us Actos Espaciales. I mean, there was an infinite exploration. You can do so much. And he explored all of that, countless times through countless works. The dots, the lines, the forms, the geometrics. And you can see here the diversity with which he uses crayons, oil on paper, pencil. So the mediums change. So, I mean, there is an infinite exploration that one can do, and that he certainly did. But I don't think he ever thought and ever really valued himself as an artist. I think he saw his art and himself as in his teaching and himself in that world as being a limited participant. And that what was more important were his conclusions and his writings that were a manifestation of that art. And he's demonstrated by his titles, by his writings, and there were so many books that he published, that he was very self-confident. And when he went to Brussels right before he died to attend a conference on cybernautics, right?
Yeah.
And
I don't remember the exact title, but yes.
yeah, and he went back to Toledo to visit his family. And when they asked what he did, he said he was a writer and he was a scientist. And he never once mentioned that he was an artist. So I don't think he self-identified as an artist. I think art was there as part of the process, and that he took great pride in his writing, and where he had, and I think he saw that he had evolved in his thoughts through art to this very high field of thinking and of intellectual prowess. And so I think that's what he was really proud of.
Yeah. And yet what happens with how his life has developed afterwards, after he died, and his legacy is that at the end of the day, he's better known as an artist and all his artistic work is way more praised, which is a really interesting like contradiction maybe. But
It's paradox, right? But it's what makes him so fascinating. And, to just kind of think that these were his toss-offs and that this was, now, I do think it's very interesting because he did save all of his work.
yes,
So I think he valued his work. I think his work was important to him, but not as art in itself, rather art as a process to the writing and as a process to the other dimensions that he was exploring in his mind, philosophies.
in fact, after the last conversation that we had, that's how we arrived to the title, The Multiple Dimensions of Esteban Lisa, like his dimension as a professor, but as an artist, as a writer. And like you have this feeling of like a really rich life that was lived like all the way from the beginning of the 20th century until 1983. And that actually leads me to the last question that also I think we discussed last time that we were talking, and it is the fact that his most prolific period of time, like his more, the time in which he was most prolific was during the 1950s and 60s, right after he had made a full career at the postal office in Argentina, but also after having a whole life as well as a professor in the Escuela de Adultos.
Mhm.
And so I wanted to ask you to finish the conversation. What do you think of the fact that his most prolific period was after retirement? And what should we, like, why is that important to talk about? And what does it say about him and about life after retirement, I would say as
Well, I
well.
love that. I love it personally. I think it's fabulous to say you can start, a second chapter of your life at 60 and be the most prolific. I think now when you say prolific, are you talking about like prolific in his writing? Or are you talking about prolific in his
Well,
art?
I think in general, because like on
Yeah.
the one hand, in 1956, he found like he, with the help of his students, he decided to create the Escuela de las Cuatro Dimensiones, the Instituto de Cosmovisión. So he has these two endeavors happening at the same time that he publishes Kant, Einstein, and Picasso, and at the same time that he is writing, he is making daily series like Actos Espaciales, like Juego con Líneas y Colores. And when one starts to study the production of Esteban Lisa, it is easy to realize that after 1956, he had enough time to do all of this. And it is possible, I don't know I have been thinking about that question. It is easy to consider that maybe he just had too much work before, like in the postal office, and then he had all this energy that allowed him to actually go through these different projects. And that's why like after looking and studying his biography, but also looking at these different projects, it makes me feel that his most prolific period was the 1950s and 60s.
Yeah. I think, I mean, this is just my personal opinion. I think he was happiest at that time because I think he felt self-fulfilled, and I think he felt like he had been a good teacher, but that he had really needed that income and needed the income from the post office to work his whole life. And now at 60 and beyond, to 80, years old, in this second or third chapter of his life, in Spanish, they call it La Tercera Edad, that he was actually happy and fulfilled. And I think you see that in his artwork, because I think you see this very light, joyful, kind of spontaneous expression in these later, periods of his life. And I think that it's precisely because he feels fulfilled. He's doing what he really wants to do. He feels as though he is making a mark on the world, which I think was important to him. Otherwise, why publish all these books? Why send them out to these incredible intellectual institutions worldwide, internationally recognized? And, I think that that's reflected. I mean, if we look at this Juegos con Líneas y Colores from 1959, and we look back at Composición from 1935 to 1940, these composiciones, which are blocks of kind of geometric abstraction in somber, heavy tones, I think you see a difference in mood. And I think he was really happy. I think he was satisfied with his life. And, I think you see that also. I don't know, there's a fabulous photograph of him back in Toledo when he left this conference on cybernautics and went back to Madrid and to visit his relatives. And he's got Toledo in the background, and he's smiling. He looks really happy. And some of these, I mean, of course, he looks really happy in his pictures with Josefina as well when he's getting married. But, if you look at him as a school teacher, some of the expressions he has on his face is he's looking at others, he's looking off. And, it's really nice to see him with this fulfilled kind of expression on his face. And it's the Alpha and the Omega. He goes back to where he came from. And as you said, he lived this fabulous life and full life. And, I think he felt his art was important, but I don't think he felt or considered himself to be an artist per se. I don't think that that was enough for him. So that's the great paradox, because now we're not really studying his writings. We are studying his art, but I think there's a connection between the art and the writings that can't be ignored. So
thank you so much. This is a really wonderful way to finish the conversation, I think, because it is quite joyful, and it is wonderful to consider the importance of to have a fulfilled life.
And you can begin a second chapter at 60 and live to be 80 something and really feel fulfilled in what you really want to do instead of what you have to do to make ends meet. So he's a wonderful kind of exploration for us. And, the thing about paradoxes and enigmas is that they really can't be solved. And we just have to sit with that. And we kind of have to look at these contradictions and kind of accept some of those contradictions for what they are, and not try to necessarily explain them. And that's the mystery, I think, that he's captured also in his work.
Yes. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. It has been wonderful to talk
Taking
with
the
you.
time to listen and to explore these ideas with me. It's always wonderful to have our conversations, Juan Gabriel. And I love the show. I came to see it. It's just absolutely gorgeous. And I had to, be very careful not to buy the whole thing out, because it's just so beautiful. And his work is just so wonderful to see all together.
Yes, thank you so much. And I look forward to other conversations about Esteban, Lisa, but also about other artists. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Ojalá, ojalá. Okay. Take good care. Best of luck.